let's get a couple things out of the way. All right, let's just start. All right? No one's really being silenced on our campuses, okay? All right? There are free speech problems on our campuses for sure, okay? But look, I'm a full tenured professor at a major research university. The things I'd have to do to get fired, I can't even say. I mean, that's how bad they are, okay? There are 4,000 places in the United States where you can get a BA. All right, they all vary from, they all differ from each other, but in the vast majority of them, nobody's talking about microaggressions or trigger warnings. Nobody's talking about safe spaces. Keep in mind, half the undergrads go to community colleges. All right, a quarter of undergrads are 25 or older. A quarter of them have kids. Okay, those people are just way too busy putting food on the table, like to worry about, microaggressions. All right, and by the way, I'm speaking now. Right? Nobody's policing me, nobody's watching me. So as you listen to me talk about my concerns about free speech, please understand how I'm trying to temper them. All right? Yes, I'm concerned about certain aspects of free speech, but this isn't a gulag, this isn't a camp. You'll hear these words sometimes, and especially at this moment in political history, we have to be extraordinarily careful about the words we use. We cannot go down into the vortex, into the nuance-free, data-free, bullying vortex of some of our unnamed leaders, because that will make us like him. However, there has been a narrowing of debate and discussion on our campuses. There absolutely has been. And there's good survey literature showing this, okay? So you ask college freshmen, is it safe to hold unpopular positions on this campus? Generally, 40% of them say yes, which is not good enough for me. That's like a failing grade, even with grade inflation, all right? And then, most depressingly, by the time they're seniors, 30% say yes. That's not good, all right? Anyone who cares about the university should be upset about that, right? That only 40% of people say that, freshmen say that it's safe to have an unpopular position, and by the time they're seniors, fewer do. With respect to the faculty, 16% say it's safe to hold unpopular positions. 16. That's not good enough for me. Everyone should be safe, speaking of safe, to hold an unpopular position, but clearly they're not. Let me give you a great example that I discovered in this research that was quite surprising to me. It turns out when you survey faculty anonymously, 40% of them oppose the use of race in college admissions. Now, just for the sake of transparency and honesty, I can tell you that I'm in the 60%. On balance, I actually think that race-based affirmative action has been a great boon for our universities and for our lives. All right? But I was nevertheless upset and ashamed to read this number. Not because people are opposing affirmative action, that's their right and their duty if they believe it. That I didn't know the number was that high. That means people aren't speaking. Right? That means in some way they're self-censoring. And that can't be good for affirmative action or the university. So do I. All right? I think the rise of psychology as a metaphor has an important part of the answer. It's not the only answer. We didn't invent the accent on the psychological. In fact, if you look at Brown v. Board of Education, it's actually a psychological argument. I often give my students that case and I say, what's bad about state-sanctioned segregation? I say, what's bad according to Brown v. Board of Ed? And actually what's bad is in footnote 11, the work of Kenneth Clark and Mamie Clark and Gordon Allport, social psychologists, who did these experiments, including experiments with dolls, in which they said that the experience of being a pariah and being segregated by law actually damages the self-esteem of people that are segregated. That was the argument. And you might have read that Ken Clark did these doll experiments where he showed African-American kids dolls. All right, do you like a white doll or a black doll? And a lot of them chose the white doll, which he took as a sign of low self-esteem for blacks. Here's the thing that actually, it's a little dweeby, but maybe you've read about this, maybe you haven't. It turned out actually in that experiment that the kids in the integrated schools actually, by Kenneth Clark's definition, had lower self-esteem. They were more likely to choose the white doll. The doll experiments did not really prove anything. You would not get tenure now doing them. Thurgood Marshall knew it, by the way. Okay, he said to Charles Houston, "Oh, not the blank, blank, blank doll experiments again." He had a very salty tongue, but he was a lawyer, right? And a lawyer shows damage, right, or has to. By the way, Thurgood Marshall was one of the great comics in the history of American government. I mean, he was unbelievable. You know, remember, he was the lead attorney for the NAACP in Brown, and 8 years later, he's on the Supreme Court. That's unbelievable. And Marshall understood race and racism. And what he liked to do is hang out in the elevator. And tourists would come into the Supreme Court, and they would look at him and they would say, "Fourth floor, please." He'd say, "Coming up, boss." And then at the end, tell them that actually he was a Supreme Court justice. We didn't invent this accent on the psychological. But there is no question that, especially starting in the 80s and 90s, it takes on a new resonance and meaning in our discourse, especially our political discourse. So the term microaggression was actually coined in 1970 at the heart of the civil rights era by a psychologist at Harvard named Clarence Pierce. And he used it to describe what he called the subtle, indirect, and unconscious kinds of insults that African Americans especially endure. But nobody knew anything about this, as best I could tell. I find no references to Clarence Pierce. It's revived in the 2000s by a guy who teaches at Teachers College, an Asian American guy named Daryl Wing Sue. And Daryl Wing Sue basically rediscovered this guy, Clarence Pierce, who, as best I can tell, nobody paid any attention to. But interestingly, by the 2000s, they start to. In Sue's work takes on this huge resonance. And he writes books in which he says that microaggressions and microaggressors are worse than the Ku Klux Klan. I'm not kidding. This is what the book says. He says, "It is not the white supremacists, the KKK members, or skinheads who pose the greatest threat to people of color, but instead well-intentioned people, strongly motivated by egalitarian values, who see themselves as fair-minded and decent people and would never consciously discriminate." This is the racism that doesn't know its name, and so he's going to name it. These little slights, which Sue describes as paper cuts, each one of which maybe doesn't take a toll, but in some he thinks take a huge toll. There are two kinds. One of them underscores your difference, and one of them erases it. That's what's complicated about microaggression. So the ones that underscore the difference, like, where are you from? So Daryl Wing Sue was born in Oregon. His parents are Chinese, right? And so people say, "Where are you from?" And he's like, "Well, F you. Like, what do you mean, where am I from? I'm as American as you." And he'll say, "Well, I'm from Oregon." And people say, "No, where are you really from? Like, you're not from Oregon. You know, where are you really from?" And he takes offense at that, I would say justifiably so, right? Because it implies that he's less American than other people. So another example he gives, he says, if you ask an Asian student with help for math, all right, this too is a microaggression because allegedly you're reinforcing some sort of difference that inheres in Asians, that Asians are, quote, good at math. What's really interesting is the other microaggressions in his glossary. He's got a whole glossary of them. They do the opposite. Instead of like emphasizing and highlighting your difference, they erase it. So when I look at you, I don't see color. Okay, this is a microaggression. There's only one race, the human race. That's a microaggression. America's a melting pot is a microaggression. And remember, I'm not saying these are microaggressions. I'm saying he says that. Okay, because all of them allegedly, in those instances, they erase your difference. And some universities indeed created trainings and policies drawing directly from this glossary. I found some universities actually adopting it wholesale, sending it to all the faculty and students, and sometimes adding their own microaggressions. Lame is a microaggression because it insults, if you say, "Oh, that's so lame," that insults somebody with a physical disability. My favorite comes out of one of the Wisconsin colleges. Politically correct is a microaggression. Because if you use the word politically, that term politically correct, you're essentially accusing people of color of being too sensitive. So in the era of microaggression, PC is itself no longer PC. So Even discussions of microaggressions can be microaggressive. So, seriously. So at Brandeis, a couple years ago, the Asian American Student Association, they created this artwork about microaggressions. They had examples straight from Daryl Wing Sue. Asians are good at math, I don't see race. But then other Asians at Brandeis denounced the exhibit as microaggressive. The student leader sent out this like mea culpa where she said, "I'm sorry anyone was triggered by the content of my microaggression." Only 15% of the demands during the protests in 2015 mentioned microaggression by name, but over half called for more reporting of race-based offenses and more serious consequences for them. On 6 campuses, students demanded questions or course evaluations about microaggressions in class. So at Emory, the students at the eval should include, quote, "Has this professor made any microaggressions towards you on account of your race, ethnicity, gender, sex orientation, language, or other identity?" Look, friends, all the comments that I just mentioned, I can imagine contexts in which they might be insulting. I can imagine taking offense at some of them myself. What I object to is an institution of learning taking normative stances on highly contested public questions. Look at the melting pot. I mean, the question of assimilation is one of the most complex and contested questions in American letters. The institution shouldn't have a position on it, right? Another of Daryl Wing Sue's microaggressions is anyone can make it in America if they work hard enough. Because allegedly that insults people who are in the lower classes by calling them lazy. Look, I can imagine lots of situations where that comment is offensive. And again, I can imagine situations in which I may be offended by it as well. But the key point here is situation and context, because the way this is presented, it's context-free, right? It's just, this statement is bad, right? Irrespective of content. And again, back to anyone can make it, that's the social mobility question, right? Also heavily contested and complex. The university cannot, must not, should not ever take a stand on a question like that. Ugh. So that's microaggressions. Let's do some trigger warnings. And let me just say in advance, I'm sorry if anyone is triggered by my discussion of trigger warning. I'm going to give you a trigger warning about trigger warnings. The genealogy here is interesting. It's really different. It doesn't come from academia. Like microaggressions has like a dweeby professorial genealogy. But trigger warnings are different. They come from the feminist blogosphere. When the internet started to kick in the 90s, women's organizations started to ask for trigger warnings on the net for material that was about sexual violence. Reasoning, I think, quite fairly, that perhaps somebody who had been a victim of sexual violence, if they encountered this subject without premonition or pre-knowledge, that they could be quite upset by it. That makes utter sense to me. Here's what doesn't. A trigger warning for Downton Abbey. Yes, it's happened. Okay, students have demanded a trigger warning for Downton Abbey because there's like bad shit in Downton Abbey. You know, like suicide and some violence, sexual violence, and there's all kinds of bad. It's true, right? But people have demanded trigger warnings for classes and lessons about addiction, about bullying, about suicide, about pregnancy, and my all-time favorite, at one of our elite campuses, a student in a class about horror movies demanded trigger warnings before a bloody scene. It's an elective! And it's about horror movies! WTF! What were you expecting? Right? I mean, that's what a horror movie is. It's bloody. At a university in Minnesota, students cancel the annual hump day. Insert joke here, hump day, yes, you pet a camel. all right, after complaints that it was cruel to animals, but most of all, that it was insensitive to Middle Eastern peoples. And that they might be triggered by the presence of a camel, and that it would make for, quote, an uncomfortable and possibly unsafe environment. And here we see the language of safety coming in. So one of the themes in my work and my op-eds has been how quiet, frankly, the American faculty has been on all these subjects. They are administratively and student-driven. Think about the X, friends. Here's the X. I mean, you see X. If we're talking about race, you think Malcolm X. I want you to get the institutional X. Here's what it is. This is the full-time faculty. This is the full-time administrators. That's right. So when I started in this business, back when I was teaching Anne French, there were more full-time faculty than there were administrators. X, baby. All right? Okay? There are many more administrators now than there are faculty. And the faculty have been overwhelmingly quiet on these questions, which is something we should talk about later. But there are exceptions, and one of them is the University of Chicago, where Jeff Stone, who's a law professor and free speech advocate and theorist, he led a group that drafted a free speech statement. And the Maroon, which is the student newspaper, they editorialized against it. Here's what they said, quote, "While it's important for students to challenge each other's opinions, this should not come at the expense of students' mental well-being or their safety." And there's that language again, right? That language of the psyche, right? Of mental well-being, of safety. And again, friends, let me be clear. I have no doubt that people can be injured by words. I've felt it. Everybody has. Like, who in their youth or their adulthood wasn't stung by a word at some point? Okay? Everybody has been, right? The question is, how do you make a politics on that basis? There's another problem. The more we talk about that language, the more it teaches us to feel injured. Sociologists talk about feeling rules. Arlie Hochschild wrote this brilliant book about actually airline stewardesses about 35 years ago called The Managed Heart. And the point of the book is that feeling is obviously subjective. Everyone feels differently, right? And yet, the social scripts around us can bias us towards feeling certain ways, right? You observe people around you, okay, what they say and do in your presence, okay? And it doesn't determine your emotions, but it can structure them and bias them. And my feeling is, at institutions like mine, where it seems every week we have another meeting about how injured people are, that we are actually making them feel injured. And I don't know how that does them favors. So, you know, a really good example. Up at Harvard a couple of years ago, you may recall that there was this episode where somebody broke into the law school and vandalized the portraits of the faculty of color by putting pieces of black tape over their mouths. And this made the national wire, and there were huge demonstrations outside of Harvard Law School, and lots of students saying that they had been personally traumatized by this. Well, Randall Kennedy, who teaches the law school and is himself an African American, so his portrait too was vandalized, he wrote this op-ed that seems like everyone except me has ignored. All right, because of course it doesn't fit his discourse at all. And which he made a couple of really interesting points. He said, first of all, every protester was assuming that this vandalism was done by a racist. We don't know that. It could possibly have been somebody who was trying to, you know, call attention to the muzzling of the faculty, right? Or bring more attention to the plight of African Americans at Harvard, right? But the baseline assumption, right, was that this was a racist act. He says it could have been, and he's right, but we don't know. And then he said, even if it was, how exactly did it harm us? He's like, my portrait was vandalized. I can't say I'm happy about that, but for Christ's sake, I'm at Harvard. Like, how bad can it be? Really? You know? And in all this discussion of privilege this and privilege that, could we talk about the privilege of people at Harvard? Like, whatever their race? You know? And he says, my fear is that this language of injury is going to promote what he calls an inflated sense of victimization. And also, what I would call the trauma overload. So the more you use that word, what happens to the content of it? Right? If everything is a trauma, what's a trauma? I mean, look, I know there is racism on our campuses. How could there not be? Our society is riven by racial prejudice and fantasy. It would be a fantasy to imagine that our colleges would be somehow independent of that. And yet, we gotta be careful about the words we use. Somebody who was traumatized by that event at Harvard, I would like to see them go with a straight and unembarrassed face to a Syrian refugee center or a shelter for sexually abused teens, and with a straight and unembarrassed face tell them that they were traumatized too. I would just I don't think they could. And then what happens to the meaning of the word? It's like people that call everything a lynching. Like Clarence Thomas, in his Supreme Court, hearing, it's a high-tech lynching. This is a lynching, this is a lynching. Look, whatever it is that sucks that you're calling a lynching, I'm sure it sucks. But if you think it's a lynching, you know what? You don't know enough about lynching. Go read a little bit. Find out what an actual lynching was. And then maybe you won't call everything a lynching or a Holocaust or call everything Nazi, right? You will very quickly go into that vortex, all right, where nothing means what it says. And also, who's going to judge, quote, mental well-being? Who's going to judge feelings of safety? If people say they're injured, who's going to decide how injured they are? And who's going to create a remedy for that? Well, you already know the answer. It's not going to be the faculty. They mostly don't care. It's going to be the administration. With the support of the students, and this is the other, I think, big trend in the theme in my book, they're going to ask for more administration, more management, to keep us safe from offense. So if you go backwards in time, starting in the 80s, the first big administrative demand are speech codes. Speech codes saying that on our campus, we're not going to allow racist speech, sexist speech, etc. There are two problems with speech codes. First of all, they're unconstitutional. Every court that has looked at hate speech has found it constitutional. You may disagree with those courts, okay? But you must know as a matter of law, hate speech is absolutely protected, all right? But I would go farther. I would say that they're disempowering. Let me give you a good example. When all that stuff went down at Yale, part of it was about racist Halloween costumes, but part of it was about a racist comment at a fraternity party. So an African-American woman or a friend are trying to go into a fraternity, and somebody says something very disparaging about people of African descent. The students asked the administration to create a penalty for the fraternity, and they kept going to it. WTF, again, right? If they're a bunch of racists, don't go! Boycott! Set up a big picket line, right? And say, nobody go here. What are you looking to Big Daddy and Mommy administration for? Right? What does that do to your autonomy or your power? You can do this. Why do you need an administrator to sanction it? So there's speech codes, and incidentally, even though they've been found unconstitutional, lots of schools still have them. Okay, so, just because you pass a law or a measure, even though it's unconstitutional, if nobody bitches, all right, it will continue. So that's one. And then this thing called diversity training. You know, when I went into this book, I participated in diversity trainings, and I thought that they were useful, and then I looked at the social science record, and I became very skeptical. So, you know, there's a guy named Jim Sidanius who is now at Harvard, but used to be at UCLA, and UCLA is a richly diverse institution, and he studied 2,000 kids all the way through college. It's a big N. And he went in imagining that all this diversity training and multicultural programming would improve, change their racial attitudes. No effect. No effect. Expensive, but no effect. You know what does have effect? A radical effect? Having a roommate your freshman year of a different race. That apparently has a huge effect on your college career, on the likelihood that A, you know, you'll express positive attitudes towards other races, B, the likelihood that you will not, you know, say racist things about other races, C, the likelihood that you'll have friends in other races. That's a great predictor, which is why, from my point of view, do you get to choose your freshman roommate online here? Do you guys do that? Do we know, are you allowed to do that at Eastern? Are you?
Kind of.
That's the decline of Western civilization. To me, it's just the worst thing on the land, right? Should we be surprised at the schools where everyone chooses a freshman roommate that lo and behold, they choose someone just like them? Duh! So we're not even leveraging the value of the diversity, right? It's sick, man, it's sick, right? We're advertising how diverse our campus has become, although apparently not this one, all right? But we're not actually leveraging the advantage of it. So we do some diversity training. How about a little bias incident response team? How about that? All right, we've got those at a couple hundred campuses. So there's this phone number you can call, right? You can report a bias incident, and then this agency of the administration, not people by academics, right? By staffers. They're going to look at this and they're going to decide if it were bias and come up with a remedy. Well, friends. Let us imagine two students. Let us imagine that one of them is from a Muslim country, all right? And she tells a student who's gay that marriage equality or same-sex marriage is sinful, okay? Then the gay student says it isn't, and the Muslim student says, well, in my religion it is. And the gay student says, well, that's a bad religion then. Who made the bias statement? Maybe both of them did. Maybe the Muslim student who said, you know, you being gay or marrying somebody of the same sex is a sin, maybe that was a bias statement. And maybe the gay student that said to the Muslim student, well, that's a bad religion, maybe they both were. But I would plead with all of us to let them work that out. Not us. Not me. Definitely not me. So that's the area of kind of race and diversity. Very briefly, just want to talk a little bit about the other example, which is sexual assault on campus. And I'm going to try to narrow this because, again, I want some definitely some Q&A here. Let me say a couple things about this from the get-go. This one is not a psychological problem. It is all too real, okay? There are some interesting debates about how to measure it, but, you know, whether it's X number or Y number, right? It's many numbers too many, okay? And it's something that all of us, all right, students, faculty, staff, parents, alumni, okay, it's something that all of us have a duty to look at, take seriously, and address, all right? And yet, all right, it's also led to a constriction of dialogue. And in the name of mental health. Should you question a given incident? or even the system for adjudicating it, what are you doing? You're re-traumatizing the victim. Have there been instances of people that have been falsely accused of this awful crime? There have been. You can read about them. All right? Go back to the Duke lacrosse case. Those kids were awful human beings. They said terrible racist things to an African-American exotic dancer, but they didn't rape her. All right? Go back to the UVA case that was misreported by Rolling Stone, leading to a very big libel judgment. All right? Some of the kids in that fraternity weren't particularly nice people either. Okay? But they didn't rape a student. But, all right, even in the lead up to those things, when people like me started to raise questions, what were we doing? We were re-traumatizing. You're in denial. Don't you recognize the problem? Can't we be adults? Why can't we acknowledge that this is a huge problem collectively for us as educators, citizens, human beings, right? And yet some of the systems we've devised to address it are highly imperfect and sometimes lead to unjust outcomes. Why are those inconsistent statements? I see nothing inconsistent about them, except for the putrid quality of dialogue on our campuses that prevents us from saying those two things at the same time. There's nothing inconsistent about it, right? And yet, when I raise the Rolling Stone thing, all right, in audiences that aren't as seemingly friendly as this one, people will say, how can you say there's no sex assault? I'm like, dude, did you hear what I said? Right? There's plenty and way too much. In some ways, it's become more difficult to talk about and more difficult to adjudicate because the federal government has gotten in on the act in a big way via Title IX. If you heard about Title IX before 2011, you heard about it with respect to sports because Title IX was the 1972 addendum to the education law that said, if you want federal money, you can't engage in discrimination. And its most tangible and awesome outcome had to do with sports. Check it out. When I was in high school, 8% of varsity athletes were female. And by the time my daughters were in high school, it was 43%. I mean, that's just unbelievable, right? And you can't even price out how many great things happen from that. Like, if you don't think, if you're one of these people that hates big government and doesn't think the federal government do anything good, right? Just look at Title IX. That's tangible, that's real. How many lives did that change? All right? And yet, all right, starting in 2011, Title IX got invoked in some ways that I would regard as hugely problematic. What happened was the federal government started to look at sexual assault, which it should, and say, look, if you at Eastern or any other place, if you haven't addressed this in a substantive way, you're going to have to if you want to keep dipping in our till. That seems fine to me, but of course all the devil's in the details. And the federal government provided them. And they said, what you have to do to really address this problem is use what the lawyers call the feather standard, okay, or the preponderance of evidence standard, right? So in most criminal cases, it's not like, are you 51% guilty or 49% guilty, right? You have to be guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, all right? And if you're not beyond a reasonable doubt, you're innocent. And you are innocent until you are proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And the Fed says that's not going to work anymore. Okay, you have to use a preponderance of evidence standard. So if you decide there's a 51% chance that this kid committed sexual assault, he did. Okay, 51%. And there's more. It also said that if you want to address this seriously, you have to let victims appeal, or accusers, if you will, appeal an outcome, but you can't let the accused appeal an outcome. Isn't that double jeopardy? So what this means, if there's some adjudication and the alleged assailant is found innocent, the victim can ask for another trial. But it doesn't work the other way around, right? If you're found guilty, you don't have any route of appeal. Also, the accused can bring a lawyer to campus but can't speak with a lawyer during the hearing. and the lawyer cannot cross-examine the victim, or the accuser, if you will. It seems to me these are all highly contestable features. And when I say contestable, I don't mean wrong, okay? There may be a defense for them. John Krakauer, the guy who wrote, Into Thin Air, and then, the amazing book about LDS, about the Mormons. His most recent book is about this issue. It's called Missoula, and Krakauer he's an unbelievable investigator. He is like a dog, all right? And he gets to everyone and everything. So if you want to read about this issue, read Missoula. And Krakauer and I have some pretty serious disagreements because, Krakauer's view is, look, if there's even a chance that this kid committed this, why not just get rid of him? I mean, you're not sending him to jail. He's got no right to go to the University of Montana, right? That's not in the Constitution, right? I'm not suggesting he go to jail, and I just think that's too precious, right? That's too easy if you're one of the people that was actually innocent. We get a whole bunch of different Title IX investigations and complaints. And then we also get this fascinating thing called affirmative consent, also at the urging of the federal government. And affirmative consent means that every act, and I mean every single act, must be explicitly and affirmatively consented to by both parties. Antioch College created this rule like 30 years ago, and it made an SNL skit. Is this cool? Is this cool? But it went from an SNL skit to reality. Here's the thing. If even one of you is wasted, you're in violation. Both of you are. Think about it. Right? If both parties have to affirmably consent to each successive build-up of physical intimacy, if one of you is wasted, we're breaking the law. Both New York and California have now signed on to, our two biggest states, to affirmative consent. Anyone who's wasted and has sex is breaking the law. That's right. Okay? Now, what if both parties are wasted? This has led to two lawsuits both at Occidental and Duke. And in each of the lawsuits, the couple wakes up, none of them remember what happened, and the female says that the guy raped her. In each case, only the male was found guilty. These both led to litigation, and in each instance, the accused, the guy, collected. But as part of one of these litigations, one of the deans at Duke was asked, why, if they're both drunk, why do we accuse the guy? And she says, it is the male's responsibility to gain consent before proceeding with sex. I don't know where you get that. I don't know why that seems like a very antiquated, and I would even say anti-feminist idea to me. So the problem in some of these cases, I think, is a presumption of guilt. That in some places, the bias against the victim, which is historic and endemic in sexual assault, has been replaced with a bias against the accuser. We saw that with the Rolling Stone, business at UVA. And there's some numbers to back me up here. Between 2006 and 2010, you look at insurance claims. Insurance claims tell you a lot. 3/4 of insurance claims paid in sex assault cases go to the accused, not to the victim. That's interesting, right? That tells you that something's wrong, and something is. Something's wrong with sex assault, big wrong, all right? And something's wrong with the way we're addressing sex assault. But how can you carry on a discussion about this? How can you do it within those psychological premises that I was describing earlier? How can it be done? So at Northwestern, you might have read about the case of Laura Kipnis. Laura Kipnis is a communications professor of some note. And in 2015, she wrote a piece in the Chronicle of Higher Ed in which she argued that there was too much sexual policing on campus. And it was a controversial article. She has tenure, and she used that tenure. She said that when she was in graduate school, she had an affair with a professor, and she doesn't see any reason why university should get in the way of that. Again, this is a controversial opinion. I'm not saying it's widely shared, but it was hers. And here's what happened. Students marched on the president's office demanding that she be fired. Why? Because under Title IX, she had created a hostile environment. They felt that her article about these sexual issues had itself made a hostile environment. At San Bernardino College, there was a professor who, in a gender studies class, is punished for asking his students to define pornography. Not to watch pornography, not to defend pornography, to define it. Students said they felt that that very assignment created a hostile environment. So, what are we expecting here? What are we asking? We're going to adjudicate every single case. We're going to find exactly the right answer. Really? So our students, they expect us, we minimally competent university people, to say with absolute certainty in every case what happened and who should be penalized. So what happens at the administrative university is that students demand more, right, and better, and they're inevitably disappointed, and they demand more, right, and that falls short, all right, and they demand more. Make this right, dad and mom administrator. Oh, but you can't, because you sort of suck. So let's have more of you. And then you fall short again because you suck. All right. And yet, let's have more. And it's really interesting. For most of our history, and up until Hillary Rodham Clinton's time, students and administrators are serious loggerheads. I mean, you talk about loggerheads. In the 19th century, there are like food fights everywhere. Seriously. And riots about how bad the cafeteria food was. At Oberlin College, incidentally, Sylvester Graham, who was a temperance and health advocate, he, one year in the dining hall, instituted the Grahamite diet, which was bran and water. And the students rioted big time. But there is a legacy of this, which I'm sure you know. It's called the Graham cracker. Yes, that's where it comes from. It's a very primitive time back there. There were no marshmallows. There were no s'mores. Very backwards time. So for most of our history, students and administrators, they're at loggerheads. And right into the 60s, the free speech movement happened in 1964, and Clark Kerr, who was the chancellor of University of California, he says that Mario Savio and the free speech protesters are, quote, university haters. So the administrators are like, you little sniveling, spoiled shit, all right? What are you complaining about? Today it's the opposite. The administrators are like, oh, you butterfly snowflake. What can I do for you? I'm so sorry we have failed you. Would you like more programming? Would you like another center? Okay, would you like another speech code, a diversity training, a bias incident response team? Yes, we'll find the exact culprit in every single complicated sexual assault case. We'll do on exactly the right penalty. Yes, more rules, more offices, more trainings. How are they going to grow up? Really? How are they going to grow up? I'm talking about you, friends, right? We're not the angry biblical father of the in loco parentis parietal rules today. We're like a helicopter mom, okay? And this is a cultural thing, is it not, in the middle and upper classes? I mean, a couple years ago at NYU, I had like an aha moment where I have an undergrad, and she was having some problems in the course, nothing serious, garden variety, nice kid, and she came to talk to me, which is what she should do. We talked about it. And I hear her at the elevator, and I just hear her voice. She says, yeah, Mom, just talk to him. Nice guy, bit of a hard ass. And I didn't mind that she was calling me a hard ass, or a nice guy, right? But there was something hugely poignant to me about this moment. I mean, price it out, friends. Think about this, right? Mom already knows she's having problems in the class. Mom already knows that she's going at this designated time to see Professor. And as soon as she sees Professor, she's calling Mom. How is that good for her development as a human being? I don't see it. I just don't see how that could be good. So just to sum up here and to conclude, if you go backwards in time and you look, for example, at the Port Huron Statement, which is 1962, it's kind of still the iconic expression of kind of the nascent student protest movement. And it's written by Tom Hayden, who, among other things, was married to Jane Fonda. And it has this really interesting language. It says, we need to wrest control from the administrative bureaucracy. That's what it says. We need to wrest control from the administrative bureaucracy. And if you look at Hillary's speech in 1969, you see the same thing. Let's have fewer curricular requirements. Let's have pass-fail. And then she writes, quote, students should direct their own education. Yeah. She says, again, we're searching for more immediate, ecstatic, and penetrating modes of living. We're all exploring the world that none of us understand. It's such a great adventure. I think that's right. I think it is. And if we look at this the right way, students are on the cusp of revolution that they will lead. If you think courses are racist and professors are racist, and some of them are, don't wait for the curriculum to change or an administrator to sanction them. Organize your own teach-ins, your own classes. If you think a frat is racist, don't demand some sort of bogus penalty from the administrators. Boycott the parties. If you think a campus newspaper is bigoted, make your own blogs and your own zines. If you want gender-neutral bathrooms, which, by the way, you have here, which is interesting, if they're not gender-neutral, just put up your own signs on them, which is happening in some places. Hillary's right. America's a great adventure. None of us know where it's going. But at our universities, we will narrow that adventure if we continue to think of it in these psychological terms. And we'll narrow the adventure if our students invest ever more power in the people that run the institutions instead of in themselves. Thanks very much.
We have some time for questions, not an enormous amount, so I would ask you to stand up, be recognized, and then please don't make speeches, just ask questions.
Yeah, only I get to make the speech.
Right. One of the things you may not recognize, given the laughter earlier, is that there are significant rules here still about who gets to be in whose room and when.
Yeah. No, there still are schools, a minority of schools.
They were laughing, it's like, whom do we get to thank for this?
Yes, sir. Hold on, what's your name?
My name is Micah. Thanks for coming. Why? So a lot of this discussion has been focused around college campuses in particular, which makes a lot of sense, especially the talks you're talking about. In what other arenas do you see this kind of behavior slipping into, broader than just the college campus? Because I don't particularly see it in the college administration locally here, but I see it a lot in social media all the time. So could you?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. I mean, I think there are two places you see it. I mean, you see it, as I mentioned earlier, just in family life. Look, we cannot underestimate the effect of these gadgets, and I still have a flip phone, right? But why did I get it? I get it. I got it because when my kids were in high school, they said, "Dad, if you want to talk to me, that's what you're going to need." And by the way, don't call me. Text me. My daughters they're young adults now. If I call them, they're like, "Dad, why are you calling me? Like, why don't you just text me?" I'm like, "I don't know. I love you. I want to hear your voice." Right? But here's the thing. I mean, seriously. And I struggle with this as a parent. I'm sure you parents and kids, you do too. It is so damn easy to do. I had a class of 100 at NYU 2 years ago, and I turned around and I said, I want you to raise your hand if you have some kind of communication with a parent daily. And communication can be any kind. It can be a text, it can be an email, it can be a phone call. There were over 100 students, 90% said yes, at least once a day. I got to tell you, I went to college in the late 70s. I called collect on something. That was my job. I was dutiful about it, and I did it. But if I had called at any other time, my parents would have thought that there was something wrong, or that I needed money. I mean, it was yes, And so, to get to Micah's question, I think what's the broader surround here? I think one of the broader surrounds is that it isn't just the university that's being administratively managed. It's the kids. It's the family, right? If you're in daily contact with a parent as a college student, you are being managed. You are. You may not you might not think of it in that way, right? But that is a management, and yes, it is a limit on your autonomy. You may not think, and look, I'm as guilty of this as anyone, right? And I struggle with it all the time. One of my daughters lives in California and the other one lives in New Orleans, okay? And I'll go like 2 days and I'm like, I haven't texted with either. I'm like, all right, should I? Like, should I just say, hey, what's up? Oh, look, Sarah texted me. It's my older daughter. I'm not going to reply. I'm going to let her wait. So I think that's absolutely part of it, but there's more with the technology part, the social media part. I think that since so much of our communication is mediated by these devices, there's no question that you become less skilled in doing the kind of work that politics requires, right? If you're spending all this time online gaming or Facebooking or whatever, okay, should it surprise us that you would rather like a speak code for those awkward moments where you actually have to talk to somebody? One of my daughters said, you know why I don't like talking on the phone? She said, because when somebody says something, you've got to say something back. That sucks. Right? Instead of just with texting or social media, it's up to you. Right? I think that one of the reasons, and look, speech codes are popular. They happen to be unconstitutional, right? But they're popular. And I would argue one reason they're popular is that we have less experience in doing what my daughters call FTF, face-to-face. Like, I thought that was everything. But no, right? That's this very distinct and weird and awkward and scary, okay, kind of exchange that doesn't happen over a machine, that has its own cadence that you don't necessarily govern, and you kind of don't know what to do. Like, how do I do this? Like, okay, you voted for that guy and I voted for this person. How do we talk about this? Like, maybe I'll say something that would piss you off, and I don't know how to do that, and I don't want to do that, so let's just not. I think that's a much broader issue, and I think it also touches on the fact that we were talking about this at dinner, that just with respect to our politics, especially our national politics, we are so incredibly polarized now. We've actually segregated ourselves into ideological bubbles. And that too makes it incredibly difficult to learn how to have conversations with somebody that you disagree with, because you just surround yourself with people and media that you agree with, right? So for those awkward times where you actually have to talk, let's just have a set of rules. And let's have somebody govern all of it, all right? And manage all of it. So everything will be okay and comfortable and safe, because being uncomfortable is like the worst effing thing you can be. Why? Well, somebody explain that to me. Being uncomfortable is like everything. If you're comfortable, you're not learning shit. You're just not, right? Learning is discomfiting. It's like, whoa, I never, ooh, that's weird. Like, I hadn't thought of it that way. Like, does that include, okay, there's this thing called racism. Well, God, am I a racist? Like, do I have white privilege? What does that mean? Like, how should I interact with people that aren't white if I'm white? Like, none of this is easy. All of it is deeply uncomfortable. And it should be. Why must we be comfortable? Now, to go back to Micah's question, I think there's one other part. It does, I think, it's more specific to universities, and I would guess, just looking around here, not to this one. Our universities, as they have become more expensive, have become hotels. Have you seen some of the stuff at Penn where I work? I mean, it's just unbelievable. Like, I gotta tell you, I lived in a total dump. I went to Columbia in the 70s, and it really was a dump. But I explained that to my students, and they're like, so professor, your room was a dump, and the food was sucky, and there was a lot of crime. What was good? I'm like, no, that was good. Right? You know, like, that was real. Right? And that was ascetic. Oh no. Oh no. Everything, this is part of being comfortable. Having really nice stuff. Now, here's the thing. I have not taken a vow of poverty. Okay? I have some very nice things too. I'm not a 1%er, but I'm certainly a 3 or 4. Okay? But if, like this institution, you take liberal arts and liberal learning seriously, what college should force you to do, is to inquire about what the good life is, what a life worth living is. How can you do that if it's already answered the question by showering you with so much nice shit? Seriously, what's a good life? Life with lots of nice things. Look, that's one answer. It could be your answer, and that's your right. But I object to institutions answering it prima facie. Right? And that's what they do. To make you comfortable. Nice dining hall, nice gym, all right, okay, nice dorm, very, very comfortable. Well, you're paying out the wazoo, right? Okay, I get it. You know, a lot of my students are like, yeah, it could be nice. Like, have you seen the price tag? So all of this, I think all of this connects, right, to this managed and comfortable environment, right? To manage, to comfortable, to allow us, I think, to ask the questions that we need to be asking. Other questions here. Yeah, sir, your name?
Terry.
Gary?
Terry.
Oh, Terry.
And on the whole psychology of this, with, in situations, in my profession as a bishop of the Lutheran Church, the requirement of everyone to have a forensic psychiatric evaluation so the administration can start to manage where you are on your absolutes and your values. How does that all relate to this whole academic area when you're saying, and if you don't, I don't know if Penn has that, but our combination is, if you don't undergo a psychiatric evaluation, resign.
Yes.
You go, whoa.
Or there could be liability dimensions. I mean, look, it absolutely is, right? And I'm glad you mentioned that, Terry, because, I think the lawyer of the apocalypse has a part to play in all this, right? There's no question about it. I mean, I'm not the person that blames lawyers for every bad thing, but let's do it anyway. There's absolutely no question that a lot of very creative plaintiff attorneys found out interesting ways to sue universities where bad things happen to kids, right? So there's a very famous case up at MIT where there was a suicide, right? And the parents lawyered up, and they successfully argued that MIT should have seen this coming, and they made a huge collection, right? What's that going to do? I mean, look, by the way, I don't mean to rag on administrators. At NYU, I was an administrator for 6 years. Okay, they have a tough job, but it's made harder by the lawyer of the apocalypse. Right? It isn't just that you have to be comfortable, right? If you experience some serious discomfort, you're getting sued. That just makes it all the harder. There's no question about it. Yeah. Other questions, and doesn't have to be from a dude.
Well, we'll have time for one more question,
Okay, so
and
not
then
a dude.
we can do informal conversation after.
Yeah.
So last question.
Yeah. Non-dudes. Yeah. Anne?
I have a quick question, and that is, if someone responds by saying they take offense, or you're hurting them,
Yes.
have you ever come up with any good retort for that that kind of brings it back to a civil discussion that's not, I mean, I'm just wondering.
It's
have you
really
ever come
hard.
up
I
with
mean,
anything?
Anne, I have struggled with this a lot, and, look, what I try to do is I try to ask, was this about a slur or was it about an idea? I try to distinguish those. So let's take this idea of PC, okay? I wrote this essay recently called The Two Kinds of PC. And I say there's one kind of PC that's utterly defensible and one that's utterly indefensible. Here's the one the kind of PC that's defensible. I think it should be politically incorrect for anyone, including the President of the United States, to refer to women as pigs. Okay? When I say politically incorrect, I don't mean it should be illegal. It shouldn't, it isn't. Okay? I think it should be highly tabooed by decent people. All right? And that people who violate that taboo should face serious social ostracism. Right? They shouldn't actually be president. Sorry. All right. But all the stuff on the Billy Bush tape. Okay, it should be PC. It should be politically incorrect. Okay, it doesn't add anything to the discussion. Okay, and if by me saying nobody, including presidents, should call women pigs makes me PC, I'm PC. Okay, but all right, what if I'm opposed to race-based affirmative action? Is that the same as saying a bad word about a racial minority? It isn't. And that's where we have to distinguish the two kinds of PC, right? It should be politically incorrect to bandy about the N-word, all right? Although I got in huge fights with my daughters about that regarding rap music, right? Because they would say it all the time, and I would say, every time you hear the N-word, just say kike instead. And they say, Dad, they'd never have a song like that. And I'm like, okay, duh. All right, but again, I don't think it should be illegal, right? It should be politically incorrect, right? There should be huge social taboos on doing it, right? The problem, and this is to go back to Anne's question, how you respond to an offense, is sometimes people aren't responding to a slur, they're responding to an idea which they equate with a slur. Being opposed to race-based affirmative action is not using the N-word. It just isn't. Okay? And that's the distinction we have to keep front and center. I do think students have every right to object to a slur. I think they should. They should protest when they hear them. Okay? They have no right to object to an idea. All right? I mean, and when I say that, I say, obviously they can object to it. I didn't state that right. They have no right to claim injury about an idea. And I think that's the distinction that we have to hold on to.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Zimmerman, for joining us this evening and for asking us some challenging questions. One of my favorite philosophers uses this phrase that a community in decline digs its own grave with relentless consistency. And his solution to this is twofold. The one is he calls upon divine grace, which is helpful when it comes. The second solution that he calls on is for more intelligence, for a doubling down on what he calls the further question or the notion that intelligence is the way forward. The way of intelligence always requires asking another question, including in unexpected ways. And so we're grateful for that help and assistance to us. And we really do have to think hard, and we have to think in unexpected ways going forward. And some of our thoughts may be different than others, and that's part of the challenge of creating a community where other people's different thought can be engaged in a productive way. So for instance, the thing which I find most chilling is actually Hillary's claim to want to live in an ecstatic and immediate framework. I find that a terrifying notion. That's the sort of framework that I would resist because I think it must and inevitably will result in the loss of authority, the loss of judgment, and the rise of the administrative solution to it all. That's my own viewpoint. It's a very Durkheim viewpoint, actually. And there are problems with it. And those are the sorts of things that we need to be challenged and be challenged back and forth. We have blind spots, we have biases, and those need to be challenged. And we're grateful for those who help us do so. We hope you can join us again in just a short time. On the 15th, we have the Pulitzer Prize winning Walter McDougall joining us. In March, we have Naomi Schaefer Riley joining us on parenting with technology and the challenges that face. And her solution is something like shut the screen.
Hey, let me tell you, you'll never forget your first Pulitzer Prize. The other ones have been nice. That first one, right, it's special.
And I think we'll have an unexpected addition to the lineup as well. John Haldane will be joining us in April. So thank you so much. I hope to see you all again very soon. Thank you. Get the book, Campus Politics. It's from Oxford University Press. It's very good.
It's cheap.
It's cheap.
I think like that was